Hello everyone, how are you all doing this afternoon?
Good.
Good, it's good to hear. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the anti-war movement, and I have some personal perspective on it, as well as the perspective of the Answer Coalition and the work that we've done over the last 10 years. Like our two co-chairs have mentioned, on September 14th, 2001, just 3 days after the September 11th attacks, the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, came into existence and announced a planned mass demonstration against war and racism for September 29, 2001 in Washington, D.C. I was a high school student in Washington, D.C. at the time. My high school was the closest to the White House, and we felt the grief and the fear that swept the nation in the wake of 9/11 very keenly. But I also felt something else coming: the manipulation of our feelings by the Bush administration and the mainstream media to fuel a drive to war. Racism against Muslim and Arab people, which is a necessary and dehumanizing component of the building the war drive, was rampant. Amidst all of the jingoistic pro-war hysteria, I felt compelled to struggle for change, to do everything I could to work in solidarity with my brothers and sisters from the Middle East, and to stop the U.S. war machine before it struck again. So when I got a phone call letting me know that a new national coalition was forming to fight back against racism and war, I went down to their office to volunteer, and in a sense, I never left. It was not easy in those early days. The attacks against Answer and us individual organizers were swift and furious. Right-wing organizations condemned us as traitors, and many liberal organizations said it was wrong and untimely to have a demonstration against the Bush administration at that time. The people of the United States were still in a state of shock and grief on September 14, 2001, but behind the scenes, the Bush administration was rapidly putting into place a plan for military invasion and domestic repression, using the terrible events of September 11th as a pretext. Bush's announced war on terror was the rationale the administration hoped would be enough to silence any opposition. In the days after September 11th, Bush's approval ratings were 90%. In these circumstances, we knew we had no choice but to build the movement. Our first national anti-war demonstration was on September 29, 2001. That demonstration in Freedom Plaza on Pennsylvania Avenue was a watershed event. People of conscience came together under very difficult circumstances to make clear that they would not support the government's efforts to launch a global war drive abroad and eviscerate civil liberties at home. Under heavy pressure of a national propaganda campaign intended to silence dissent, many were told, even by friends and allies, that they should not speak out, and yet they came. Some of the students organizing buses were falsely told by their schools that attending the demonstration would be dangerous and unsafe, but they too came anyway. We did not know how many people would come, but we knew it was imperative that those who were willing organize against the looming imperial war drive and domestic repression. As the demonstration grew, we watched the plaza fill as people joined to take a stand together. 25,000 people came out that day, despite the intense pressure. The chants rang out from the heart of Washington, D.C. "We will not be silent," protesters chanted. "We want justice, we want peace, U.S. out of the Middle East." C-SPAN carried the demonstration, and the message went out throughout the country that resistance and organization was possible. That was the beginning of the Answer Coalition and of a new anti-racist, anti-war movement in the U.S. 7 months later, on April 20th, 2002, the Answer Coalition organized the largest demonstration in U.S. history in support of the Palestinian people. 100,000 people marched under the slogan, "Free Palestine, no war in Iraq," just 3 weeks after the Israeli reinvasion of the West Bank. Calling that demonstration was also a major controversy within the peace movement. Answer, which at its core included partnership between non-Arab and Arab American organizers, refused to accept the marginalization of the Palestinian struggle. Treating the Palestinian struggle as taboo was a shameful legacy of the traditional peace movement in the U.S. As a national student organizer, I was in a lot of those meetings with other organizations, those who said that we couldn't talk about Palestine, that we'd lose our supporters, that it wasn't right. But again, we went forward in a principled way, and we continued to build a movement for what we believed in. That demonstration marked a turning point. 100,000 people came to the White House that day to protest against the U.S.-backed Israeli occupation of Palestine and against the Bush administration's war drive. Again, C-SPAN covered that demonstration live. I was working with a high school student who lived in Virginia, but who was from Palestine that day, and I remember when she got the phone call from her grandmother, who was in Jenin, who was watching the demonstration from her living room via satellite TV. That young organizer told me that her grandmother was crying, that she couldn't believe that so many people in the U.S. would come together to stand up for Palestine. It was an incredible moment for the movement and for me personally, to see what a difference we can make with these demonstrations. That is one of the reasons why we organize, not just to change the policies of our government, but to let the people of the world who are under attack from our government, who are vilified by our media, to let them know that we stand with them. We we know the people of Palestine, the people of Iraq, of Iran, of Libya, and Syria are not our enemies. It's important that we show them, that we organize and come together to show the world what solidarity really means. On that day, the struggle of the Palestinian people was raised as a vital part of the movement for justice and peace in the Middle East. Support for the Palestinian people is now widespread among many U.S. groups because of this hard-fought battle in the anti-war movement and many others that followed from 2002 to 2005. Today, because of the efforts of many strong activists in Answer and in many other organizations, there are few in the peace movement who would suggest that Palestinian self-determination can properly be delinked from organizing for a just peace in the Middle East. In the next few months, the Bush administration made its plans for war against Iraq, and the Answer Coalition announced plans for a mass demonstration on October 26, 2002, in Washington, D.C. To the surprise of the administration and the media, 200,000 people answered that call, and a new massive anti-war movement was born. After that, on January 18th, 2003, 500,000 people marched again in Washington, D.C. It was the largest anti-war demonstration in D.C. since the Vietnam War era. I was an organizer for that demonstration. I co-chaired part of that rally. It was like 16 degrees outside. It was freezing. All of us volunteer organizers for Answer hadn't slept that week. We were working so hard, coordinating buses, calling the media, handing out flyers, sending out emails. There was a great deal of urgency to what we were doing and a great deal of support. The people of the United States did not want war with Iraq. All across the country, people were furiously building to stop the war before it started. The next month, on February 15th, 2003, millions took to the streets in thousands of cities in nearly every country to oppose a new war with Iraq. The Bush administration was determined to carry out their war in Iraq, though it was obvious that the war was based on lies and driven by profit. Iraq was invaded in March of 2003. I remember we had emergency demonstrations every day, twice a day in D.C., in which thousands of people came to the White House to express their outrage at the government's ignoring the will of the people, and also to express their continued opposition to the Bush administration's war drive. I remember hearing about demonstrations in San Francisco and New York, where they shut down bridges, where students put their bodies on the line and faced off with the police in incredibly courageous acts of resistance to war. Even after the invasion of Iraq, the people of the U.S. continued to organize, to fight against invasion and war. In the months and years that followed, hundreds of thousands more came together as the Answer Coalition became the motor for mass actions against the war in Iraq, as well as mass actions in support of the Palestinian people, against the war in Afghanistan, the bombing of Libya, and threats against Iran, and in support of the people of Cuba and Venezuela to develop free from U.S. sanctions, threats, and subversion. I can recall some of the highlights of these demonstrations, like in 2005, when the attorneys for the Answer Coalition litigated our right to have a presence right on the parade route for Bush's second inauguration. We actually got bleachers on the parade route and filled them with anti-war activists who were holding signs that said "Impeach Bush" and "End the occupations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine." Longtime friend of the Answer Coalition, Cynthia McKinney, spoke at that counter-inaugural rally, and I remember how hard it was to get her through the barricades and the checkpoints the police had set up to prevent people from coming and attending that important protest. But she made it, as did thousands of others. I don't think Bush ever had an inauguration in D.C. that went unprotested. I remember how fast his motorcade sped past our bleachers. I also remember the important demonstration in Washington, D.C. on September 15, 2007. This demonstration was different from previous demonstrations in that it was led by veterans, soldiers, and the family members of soldiers and those who had lost loved ones in the war. That event drew protesters from as far away as Chicago and LA, and they gathered in Washington, D.C. and marched on the Capitol. It was the first time that I remember working with Mike Preisner, who's on our panel today. I saw him lead a contingent of veterans at the front of the march. Thousands of people marched right up to the police line, and then the momentum of the demonstration pushed many people right through it. I hadn't exactly planned on getting arrested that day. We really didn't know what was going to happen, but in the moment the decision became clear. The woman who propelled me forward, both literally as well as figuratively, was a mother whose son had joined the military, had fought in Iraq, and had come back severely damaged, ridden with guilt and PTSD. She said he tried to kill himself more than once. He said that the things that he saw and the things that he did in this illegal, immoral occupation in Iraq were too much to bear. He'd call his mother and tell her that he thought he didn't deserve to live. So his mother came to D.C. that day to fight to end these wars so that no one else's son had to suffer what hers did, so that no more mothers would get that phone call. We were standing next to each other as that demonstration surged forward, and when she looked me in the eyes and gave me a shove, over the barricade I went. About 300 people got arrested that day, myself and Mike Preisner included. It was one of many important struggles against the war. So I wish I could stand up here and talk about every single demonstration, big and small, that's been a part of building this movement. I've had the opportunity to travel around the country doing anti-war work, and I've seen some truly courageous actions in small communities where people have stood up to the immense pressure of their conservative towns and said no to war and racism when that is not the popular position. These days, anti-war sentiment is widespread, along with frustration at the budget cuts, the tuition hikes, the lack of affordable housing and healthcare that are all part of the cost of war. You know, I've been talking a lot about the anti-war movement, but let's talk about the cost of war for 1 second. The U.S. spends about $2 billion each week maintaining the U.S. presence in Iraq and the occupation of Afghanistan. This is why, while they tell us that there's no money for schools, or for housing, or for education, or for the things that our people need. For example, the state college system in California just announced that due to budget shortfalls, they will not be accepting any new students in the fall, and in the spring, and possibly in the fall as well. How is that even possible? What do schools do except accept students and provide them with an education? Where are all those thousands of students? It's 16,000 this spring and many more in the fall. Where are they supposed to go? Education is a right and a necessity in any society. Many people around the world have recognized this. It may interest you to know that one country that put a priority on education prior to the US invasion was in fact Iraq. Iraq nationalized its oil wealth in 1972, and that's when they had the audacity to kick out all of the foreign oil companies and decide to use the profits from their rich resources to pay for the things that their people needed. After that, Iraq had by far the best university system in the Middle East. Students came from all over the Arab world and were able to study for free in Iraq. That's right, the universities were completely free. They were also completely secular. Sunni and Shia, men and women, all studied side by side there. 30% of the faculty of Iraqi universities were women by 1991. That's a greater representation than women have at many US schools, like Princeton, for example, as of 2009. Iraq was an example of what could be done when a country resists US imperialism and the greed of US corporations and focuses on the needs of their people instead. That is why the US targeted Iraq, and that is why they could not let them stand. In 1991, the US launched the first Gulf War, followed by 12 years of devastating sanctions as well as bombings. The sanctions hit the university system very hard. 10,000 professors had to leave Iraq immediately after the first Gulf War. The schools could no longer import equipment and the materials that they needed. After the invasion in 2003, when the US supposedly liberated Iraq, all they did was plunge their universities further into ruin. By the end of 2006, 280 Iraqi professors had been killed, and another 3,250 fled the country. The administration of Iraqi universities has been handed over to a series of US officials, many of whom were friends of the Bush administration, many of whom spoke no Arabic and had little understanding or interest in the education system in Iraq. One official estimated it would cost $1.2 billion to rebuild the university system in Iraq. And an article I read puts this into perspective by mentioning that North Carolina State University annual budget is also $1.2 billion. That's just for 1 year for one school in the US. The UN estimated it would cost something more like $2 billion. The US Congress, however, only appropriated $8 million for the entire university system in Iraq. USAID claimed to give $25 million to Iraq, but that money mostly went to American universities to develop their curriculum for them. In addition to lack of funding, the Iraqi universities have been hit hard by looting and violence in the wake of the war. As I mentioned, many professors have been killed, and the schools have since become an unsafe place for millions of Iraqi women who were free to study and teach there before. How much clearer could it be that the US government never cared about the well-being of the people of Iraq? This was a war based on lies and fabrications that allowed them to blast their way into this country and reap super profits from the destruction. The war in Iraq was a war for privatization, exploitation, and the expansion of the so-called free market, on behalf of the same forces who were driving the US into ruin as well. Our education system, which in many ways was never as good as Iraq's, is nonetheless being targeted for destruction that may not take the same form. No one is bombing our buildings or assassinating our professors, but has the same end result: greater profits for the war makers and the corporations, and greater misery for working people like us. What has been done in Iraq is a crime. We know that, and the people of the world know that. The people want change. They want an end to the war and a more just society for all. We want our tax dollars to fund schools, to provide affordable housing, to create jobs, to provide health care, the things that we all need, instead of these wars that only the corporations need. Over the last 10 years of struggle in the United States, we have seen that the sentiment is there. What is needed is greater organization. We need more people to come to the streets and more people to struggle in a more organized way. So that's why Answer continues to fight, not just against war and occupation, not just against racism, but for every important issue of the day. We've marched for immigrants' rights, for marriage equality, against police brutality, and for funding for education. We believe that all of the struggles are related and that the people united are truly an unstoppable force. There were others who criticized raising issues besides peace, but we felt that no U.S. movement could be relevant, inclusive, or effective without doing so. Many of us in this room know from experience that building a movement for deep systemic change does not happen overnight. Numerous organizations have come and gone in the last decade. The Answer Coalition is still here. In fact, the coalition has vibrant chapters all over the country, active in education, outreach, and mobilizing. I am one of a whole generation of young activists who came into political life during the past decade. I first walked into Answer's office when I was 17 years old. Now I'm 27, and I've had the benefit of working with an organization that places a priority on training new leaders and providing experience and guidance in the struggle. Many people in this room, such as Mr. Clark himself, have spent many decades of their lives organizing against U.S. imperialism and for a more just and peaceful world. Your experience is valuable, and your continued struggle is an inspiration to us all. The battle is not yet over, but we will continue fighting side by side, previous generations of activists and those of us who are relatively new to struggle. Together we can carry the struggle forward, and together we can win an end to war and justice for all. Sisters and brothers, let's keep up the fight for the people of Iraq and the people of the world.